with all these Sons of Liberty and all these riots and all this violence and intimidation, he decided, I'm going to send over a policing force. And so the colonists were forced to house and supply the British troops with whatever they needed. Not only that, they had to pay for it. Now, particularly in Boston, a lot of people weren't happy about this. Imagine people coming into your home and taking your stuff and looking for things and then saying, oh, by the way, we're going to live here. And so a lot of people, specifically in Boston, where the Sons of Liberty got their start, would not accommodate the British redcoats, and therefore a lot of tensions started to rise. Well, because of the Quartering Act and because of these tensions, in 1770, the Boston Massacre occurred. And this was an event that we saw on the video with John Adams, and it was an angry mob of Bostonians that were fired upon by the British, who they were giving a hard time to in front of the Boston Custom House. Now, obviously, these soldiers were outmanned, outnumbered, but it shouldn't have happened. It was an event that didn't need to take place. There were 5 people who died and 7 were wounded. Among those, a former African-American slave. His name was Crispus Attucks, and he was the first African-American to die for the cause of the American Revolution and liberty. Sam Adams would definitely jump on top of this event and call it the massacre, which obviously we know it wasn't a massacre. Only 5 people died out of the roughly 200 people that were there, but it didn't matter. He had his best friend, Paul Revere, who was a famous silversmith and dentist, and I mean, you name it, he could do anything. And this talented individual decided to create a piece of propaganda. And he created an etching that would be seen throughout all the colonies. And remember, I emphasized the idea that America is a place for perspective to be shared. And it's important that you realize they didn't have all the resources you have to spread the word and go viral and tweet things as they happen. This kind of stuff through the media and through the newspapers and what people saw was what they knew, and that's what they understood. John Adams will end up becoming the most famous character from this event because he stands for what he wants America to be, and he ends up defending the soldiers, and you can imagine how unpopular that is. We did see that as well in the film, and you know, he risked his reputation and his career and his family's safety on the idea of wanting to make sure America was free, and he wanted to prove that by defending these soldiers through the law. The etching that Paul Revere actually painted or created that was seen throughout all the colonies obviously shows a very calm group of British officers and soldiers firing upon the helpless unarmed crowd of the American rebels, and you can see this is great propaganda. More than likely, had this picture actually been shown, people might have viewed this event differently. You can see it looks more like you can see bats and things being thrown and snowballs, and you can see the commanding officer standing actually in front of his men, and he would never have ordered them to fire had he been in front of his men. So anyway, this is more of like what it actually looked like. But it didn't matter. Perception is everything, and this picture helped to start a war. Now, the British East India Company, after a short 3-year period of calmness because the king needed to relax a little bit in order to avoid tension, he gave a monopoly on tea. Now, right after the Boston Massacre, the townshend duties were repealed, except a tax on tea. Now, the difference between the tax on tea that was left was this act, the Tea Act, gave a monopoly on tea to the British East India Company, which allowed them total control over the the American tea coming in. So anyway, not to confuse you, I apologize there, but over the U.S. tea, over the tea coming into the American colonies. And essentially, every colony had to pay a tax on tea that, you know, was regulated by the British East India Company. So if you wanted to have tea, and that's what everybody drank in the time period, you had to have British East India Company tea. So, action, reaction. The Americans reply back with the Boston Tea Party. And the Tea Party is a very interesting event because it was a form of protest, and there was protest going on up and down the colonies. But it seems like Boston keeps getting the brunt of the events, and mainly it's because they act through the process with their actions. They are aggressive about how they go about protesting and letting the king know that he's doing stuff wrong. And so in response to the Tea Act, on December of 1773, the Sons of Liberty dressed as Mohawk Indians. And again, remember, this was not about hiding themselves. You can see even here on the pictures, they are not hiding their faces. They're dressed like Indians. And this is a political statement. The idea of this statement is about the concept of making sure that the king realizes that he is not treating them like British citizens. So if they're not British citizens, well, they must be something different, which in this case makes them Native Americans, which in this case, the only version of the Native Americans that the British understand are the ones that are dressed like Indians. And they effectively go over 3 ships in the Boston Harbor. They dump out 342 chests of tea into the harbor, and it's gone. It's wasted. That's lost money and revenue for the king, and man, he gets mad. So, obviously, action, reaction. The king responds to the Boston Tea Party in a way that really hurts Boston. And he decides to pass, along with Parliament, what the Americans call the Intolerable Acts, but the king called them coercive. Kind of like when your parents tell you to do something, they are coercing you into doing it, but more often than not, it's intolerable. But King George III decides that he will pass the punishment of Boston. First, he's going to close the port of Boston until the tea is paid for. Well, the problem with closing the port of Boston, that's how they make their money. So without the port, means there's no money. Then he's going to ban the Committees of Correspondence and the Colonial Assembly in Massachusetts. Not only that, but they get rid of their governor, who they chose, and they make General Gage the governor. Now, by General Gage being the governor, all of a sudden it's a state of military control. Okay, martial law is what we call it. But this is a big deal, mainly because, I mean, this is Boston. This is Massachusetts. It's been around since 1630, and it's been governing itself for that long. So 140 years of self-governing, 140 years of deciding things on their own, and now all of a sudden they've lost that privilege. And they have no economy because they live off the sea. These New England colonies are based on trade and the ocean, and they don't have that. And now they're run by a governor that is a military general, a redcoat. He also moves all trials for British officials to London, which obviously would have changed the outcome of the Boston Massacre trial, and those guys would have got a slap on the wrist and been able to go home. And then lastly, he made the quartering of the British troops even worse. So all of these are kind of problems. They're things that are going to cause problems for the Americans, and how they respond to this is going to be very important. But this is a punishment of Boston, and these intolerable acts were exactly that. They were intolerable for the colonies to put up with. Now, the best part about what the king does in action-reaction is that he creates an action that the Americans have to respond to. And in this case, the First Continental Congress decides to meet. Okay, the Committees of Correspondence, who are running wild throughout the colonies. They have communicated for the last at least 3 years since the calm period of after the Boston Massacre. And the Continental Congress says, let's come together. Let's meet. Let's hook up and talk through these issues and try to solve our problems. And on September 1774, they meet at a place called Carpenter's Hall. And 56 delegates from 12 of the colonies meet in Philadelphia. Georgia does not come. And they decide to ban all trade with Britain. So that's a good thing. But they've already decided that. They decided that at the Stamp Act Congress, but now everybody's going to try to follow through. Then they're going to agree that they should start forming a militia in Massachusetts and training up troops and encouraging Massachusetts to do that. And then they're going to, for the most part, plant the seeds of a unified continental government. This is the beginning stages. So with that being said, the Continental Congress was a success for the most part. Unfortunately, there was a lot of arguing and a lot of debating and things that went on that, for the most part, the New England colonies felt like was not enough. The New England colonies are paying the price for most of what the British are doing, and so therefore they're the ones that are being affected, and they feel like the Continental Congress is not on board with everything that is happening, and so they're pretty upset. They're kind of bitter, and guys like John Adams feel like the First Continental Congress was a waste of time. They needed to make a bold statement to the king, and they didn't do that. So they're going to head home and maybe get an event, something that's going to trigger them. And sure enough, that's exactly what they got. An event that would go down in history as the event that started the revolution. And we talked about this in Boston when the Continental Congress adjourned and people went home. You had a plan in place because General Gage would often head out